In the summer of 1897, a little girl named Amelia Earhart entered the world in a quiet town in Atchison, Kansas. Long before she became one of history's most celebrated aviators, those who knew her called her Mealy, a spirited child whose curiosity and fearless nature made it clear she was never meant to live an ordinary life. Unlike many girls of her era, Amelia embraced adventure at every opportunity. She was happiest outdoors, trading dolls and tea parties for muddy trails, towering trees, and wide open fields. Her tomboy spirit shone through in everything she did. At an age when most children were just learning the rules of the games, Amelia had already learned to shoot rifles, hunt rats around the property, and climb trees simply just to see how high she could go. When winter arrived, she searched for the steepest hills in the neighborhood, racing downhill on her sled with little concern for the risk and every desire for the thrill. Her love of exploration extended to even the smallest creatures. Amelia and her younger sister Grace Earhart spent several hours collecting insects, proudly building a collection that included moths and even a pet toad that they had discovered together. To them, every day presented another chance to explore, discover, and satisfy their endless curiosity about the world. But calling Amelia adventurous hardly captures who she truly was. She was a natural daredevil. After a trip to St. Louis, Missouri, Amelia became fascinated by the excitement. After riding a roller coaster, most children would have been content with the memory of the experience, but nope, not Amelia. Inspired by the ride, she convinced her uncle to help her recreate the thrill at home. Together, they built a homemade ramp that extended from the roof of the family's tool shed, fastening a wooden box to serve as their makeshift coaster car. With more courage than caution, she climbed inside and launched herself down the ramp. The ride ended in a spectacular crash, leaving her bruised and battered. Yet instead of fear or regret, she climbed out of the wreckage with a grin and an unforgettable realization, stating with the biggest smile on her face, "It feels like flying." She couldn't have known it then, but those four words would foreshadow the passion that would one day carry her into the skies and into history. When she was still a young girl, her family relocated to Des Moines, Iowa, after her father, Edwin Earhart, accepted a new job. It was there, at just 10 years old, that she had her first glimpse of an airplane while visiting the Iowa State Fair. The machine was little more than a fragile frame of wood and wire, nothing like the sleek aircraft that we know today. In the early 1900s, aviation was still in its infancy. Airplanes were experimental inventions built by just a handful of daring pioneers, and a few people had ever really seen one up close. And flights were very brief, often lasting less than an hour or less than half an hour and covering only a few dozen miles. To most spectators, these flying machines seem more like curious mechanical experiments rather than the future of transportation. At the time, she wasn't especially impressed. The rickety aircraft sitting on the display looked pretty awkward and pretty unimpressive, and she walked away without realizing that one day airplanes would become the center of her life's greatest adventures. As she entered her teenage years, life became increasingly unpredictable. She and her younger sister Grace spent several years living with their grandparents where they were educated at home. And during those quieter years, Amelia discovered a love for books. She could often be found wandering through her grandparents' library, immersing herself in stories about exploration, science, and remarkable people. Reading broadened her imagination and nurtured the curiosity. Around the age of 12, however, the stability she had known began to unravel right before her. She entered public school for the first time, marking the beginning of a series of dramatic changes within her family. Although the Earharts had once enjoyed financial security, her father developed a serious drinking problem that strained both the family's finances and also their relationships. Soon afterwards, Amelia's grandmother passed away. Her death triggered the sale of a family home, and many of the belongings that Amelia had grown up with were eventually auctioned off, closing the door on a very cherished chapter of her childhood. The hardships did not end there. Edwin eventually lost his job, forcing Amelia, her mother, and her sister to leave their home and move in with family friends in Chicago. The move represented far more than a change of address. It marked the end of the comfortable, carefree childhood she had once known. Years later, she reflected on this period as a moment her childhood truly came to an end. Despite the uncertainty surrounding her family, she refused to let these hardships define her and her future, and she focused on her education and graduated from Hyde Park High School in 1916. The resilience she developed during these difficult years would later become one of her greatest strengths, really helping her prepare for the extraordinary challenges that she would face as one of history's most celebrated aviators. By 1960, the world was in the midst of the First World War, and although Amelia Earhart was still a teenager, she wanted to do more than simply watch history unfold before her. She traveled to Toronto, Canada, where she trained as a nurse's aide with the Red Cross and volunteered at a military hospital. Day after day, she cared for wounded soldiers returning home from the battlefields. Many arrived with visible injuries, while others carried emotional scars that could not be seen. As she helped bandage wounds, served meals, and comforted recovering servicemen, she listened pretty closely to their stories. Among the tales of hardship and sacrifice were some remarkable stories of a brand new kind of warfare taking place high above the trenches. Pilots were engaging in aerial combat, pushing both themselves and their fragile machines to the absolute limit. To her, these accounts painted a picture of pure courage, freedom, and adventure unlike anything she had ever imagined. Long before this experience, she had already shown an independent spirit. She was fascinated by careers that society considered unsuitable for women at the time. Fields including engineering, law, and business management. These intrigued her because they demanded intelligence and determination and innovation. She had never been content with the narrow expectations placed on young women. But after hearing countless stories from these soldiers she cared for, her interest began to shift. She realized she wanted to be part of something that was exciting and part of the new world of aviation. Not by watching the airplanes from the ground or building imaginary flying machines in her backyard, but by climbing into the cockpit herself. A few years later, during the frigid winter of 1920s, she attended an air show that would have a lasting impression on her. One of the featured performers was a celebrated World War I flying ace. And during the war, a flying ace was a title reserved for military pilots who had demonstrated exceptional skill in combat by shooting down at least 5 enemy aircraft. And these aviators became some of the first international celebrities of the aviation age. Newspapers followed their exploits, crowds gathered to watch them perform daring aerial maneuvers, and many people viewed them as fearless symbols of a rapidly changing world. While Amelia and a friend stood away from the main crowd, the pilot noticed the pair and decided to put on a personal demonstration. Maneuvering sharply, he pointed his small red airplane directly towards them. The engine roared louder and louder as the aircraft raced across the field, appearing to fly straight at them. Most people would have instinctively turned and ran in terror, yet Amelia didn't move a single inch. She stood her ground, completely captivated as the airplane thundered overhead before climbing back into the sky. And rather than fear, she felt something she had never experienced before, a powerful sense of wonder, fascination, and awe. Years later, she reflected on that unforgettable moment, saying, I believe that little red airplane said something to me as it swished by. Whether she meant it literally or as a feeling she couldn't quite explain, one thing was certain. From that day forward, aviation was no longer just an interesting invention, it had become a calling, her life's purpose. The dream that had quietly begun years earlier while she rode on her makeshift roller coaster was now impossible to ignore, and Amelia would spend the rest of her life chasing the freedom she had glimpsed in that little red airplane. Her growing fascination with aviation soon led to an opportunity that most people could only dream about. Through connections her father had with influential people, she was introduced to one of the biggest names in aviation at the time, Frank Hawks, who was known for his daring flying and incredible speed. Hawks had earned a reputation as one of the fastest pilots in the world. To be invited aboard one of his airplanes wasn't just exciting, it was an extraordinary privilege that very few people would ever get the chance to experience. And for $10, roughly equivalent to about 160 today, she climbed into the passenger seat for a flight that lasted for only about 10 minutes long. And by modern standards, that might not sound like a lot of time, but 10 minutes in the air was enough to change a person's life forever. Flying was still a very risky endeavor. Airplanes were lightweight machines built from wood, wire, and fabric. They lacked many of the safety features pilots take for granted today, and mechanical failures weren't uncommon at all. Every flight carried an element of uncertainty, yet that uncertainty didn't frighten her. It actually thrilled her. There was just something about leaving the ground behind, trusting the machine beneath her, and seeing the world from above that awakened something deep, deep inside her. When the airplane touched back down, Amelia stepped onto the ground knowing she had discovered what she wanted to do with the rest of her life. Years later, she would famously say, I knew I had to fly. Now comes the difficult question. How could a young woman in the 1920s, when aviation was overwhelmingly dominated by men, turn that dream into a reality? The answer came in the form of another trailblazer that she sought out, named Netta Snook. Known to friends and family as Snooky, Snook was one of the first female aviation instructors in the United States and had built a reputation as an accomplished pilot at the time when very few women had ever even touched the controls of an airplane. Convincing her to become a student was one thing, and then finding the money to pay for lessons was a whole other thing. Their agreement was ambitious. She would pay $500 for 12 hours of flight instruction, an amount that would equal nearly $10,000 today. And it was an enormous expense, especially for someone without wealth of her own. And on top of that, she would have to take the bus and walk 4 miles to get to these lessons. Instead of just throwing her hands up and giving up and feeling deterred, she worked wherever she could. She held several different jobs, saved every dollar possible, and she eventually managed to put aside enough money to begin these lessons. Shortly after these lessons, she had already made a world record by flying to an altitude of 14,000 feet. This was the highest any female pilot had flown, and it's pretty astonishing that so soon into her flying career, she was already breaking world records as a female flyer. And in 1923, she was the 16th woman to get her pilot's license, which was number 6017. Sometimes history doesn't choose the person with the most experience, it chooses the person who captures the world's imagination. And in 1928, a remarkable opportunity had emerged. The dream of making the first transatlantic flight by a woman was still alive, but the woman who had originally hoped to make this dream happen had stepped away from the challenge. And she went on a search to find a polished, polite, all American pilot to make the trip for her instead. Captain Hilton Rayleigh, a friend of George Palmer Putnam, a publicist, was on a search to help seek out this woman. And fate has a really strange way of bringing the right people together because this led him to contacting Amelia, a relatively unknown pilot whose determination far outweighed her fame. After receiving the offer, she stated, "Under the circumstances, I couldn't say no." Joining Amelia on this daring journey were two men whose experience would soon be tested to its limits. At the controls sat veteran aviator Wilmer Stoltz, a seasoned pilot who years of service in both the U.S. Air Service and Naval Air Service had prepared him for high stakes flights. And besides him was Lewis Gordon, the expedition's skilled mechanic entrusted with the enormous responsibility of keeping the aircraft alive through one of the most ambitious flights of its era. But long before the engines roared to life, the expedition was already fighting an uphill battle. Every pound mattered. So, to make the aircraft light enough to leave the waters of Boston Jeffries Yacht Club, the crew was forced to unload 6 5-gallon fuel cans, which was a difficult compromise that highlighted just how unforgiving this journey would be. Then came the weather. Dark skies and unpredictable conditions delayed their plans, adding a whole other obstacle to an expedition that had barely begun. To many watching from the sidelines, these mounting setbacks felt less like ordinary challenges and more like ominous warnings, as though nature itself was questioning whether the flight should ever leave the ground. But for the crew, each obstacle forced them to adapt, and each delay strengthened their confidence. And every challenge that they overcame became preparation for something far more demanding: the dangerous journey that awaited them over the endless waters of the Atlantic Ocean. Soon, there would be no turning back. And now it was finally time for the transatlantic flight after some serious setbacks and a delay of around 2 weeks due to mechanical issues. Thick blankets of fog swallowed the horizon while towering waves forced them to wait and wait. Finally, the day approached where they were ready for takeoff, and eager they were, and the friendship lifted off into the mist, disappearing into a world where sea and sky blended into one. Hours into the journey, a welcome sight finally emerged from the haze. The crew spotted the SS America about 75 miles southeast of Cobh, Ireland, and they circled the ship to help track their position. And the crew attempted to write the vessel's name and location on the deck in chalk in giant letters large enough to be read from above, but by the time they began writing, they could no longer spot the aircraft, and it was long gone from their sights. Then came an even more unsettling development. Early on in the flight, the radio in the aircraft was no longer functioning, which meant that they could no longer receive weather reports and also could not update anyone regarding their statuses and their locations. And in an instance, there was no way to tell anyone where they were. They were cut off from the outside world, which is pretty nerve wracking to say the least. The crew was facing low fuel and still pretty bad weather, and without knowing their location, they knew they would need to land sooner or later, and if not, they would soon run out of fuel. They ended up landing in Bury, Easterly Wales, where at first no one even approached them, probably confused by who these people were. Although they had made this landing, they were planning on continuing the flight after getting more fuel. But due to the poor weather and visibility and lack of fuel, it was determined that the flight would conclude there in Wales, and Wilmer Stoltz made contact with their sponsors first, and Rayleigh and a reporter for the New York Times came to meet them where they landed. And on June 19th, 1928, Amelia Earhart and the crew of the Friendship completed the final leg of their historic journey, landing safely in Southampton, England. As the aircraft touched down, cheers erupted from the crowd waiting below. Reporters rushed forward, cameras flashed from every angle, and it was immediately clear that this was more than just a successful conclusion of a flight. It was the beginning of a new chapter in aviation history. The Atlantic Ocean, once considered an almost impossible barrier, had now been crossed by a woman for the very first time. Everywhere she went, enormous crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of the woman who had captured the world's imagination. Newspapers couldn't print enough stories about her remarkable journey. Cities welcomed her with parades, and thousands lined the streets to celebrate what many believed was a turning point for women in aviation. President Calvin Coolidge welcomed her and honored the achievement at the White House, cementing her place as one of America's newest national heroes.
You remember that some 5 years before you took off, when Colonel Lindbergh made his solo flight across the Atlantic and coined the aeronautical we, that it remained of the masculine gender for some 5 years thereafter until you took off. And it seems to me as if you have at last cleaned up that aeronautical we and taken the sex out of it. Miss Earhart, you are truly and indeed welcome in the city of New York. Miss Earhart and Mrs. Putnam,
gives me a very great deal of pleasure to present you with this rarely conferred medal. The whole of America is proud of you and your performance.
Well, I do thank you sincerely. I fear my exploit was not worth so great an honor.
Yet, what truly captivated people wasn't just the flight itself, it was Amelia. She never portrayed herself as fearless or larger than life. Instead, she carried herself with confidence, humility, and with genuine warmth. While others might have embraced the spotlight, she often redirected the praise towards her crew, insisting the accomplishment really belonged to all of them and not just her. Her popularity continued to grow and she became a beloved figure in America. She also became a figure in the media with the help of publicist George Palmer Putnam and went on tour. And she eventually wrote a book, and this book was called 20 Hours, 40 Minutes Our Flight in the Friendship, about the flight that she took with her crew. And her growing influence eventually led to an unlikely friendship with the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. And the two shared a fascination with aviation, and Amelia eventually took the First Lady flying. She had really become a symbol of possibility, inspiring even the most powerful figures in the nation to see the world from an entirely new perspective. Yet, she still wasn't satisfied living in the shadow of one historic achievement. She always wanted to make history on her own terms. And in 1932, she accomplished exactly that by becoming the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, which was a flight lasting 14 hours and 56 minutes, a feat that erased any lingering doubts about her abilities as a pilot. She continued to gain recognition from prominent flyers because she was the first woman to fly across North America solo, and a flight on January 11th, 1935 from Honolulu, Hawaii to Oakland, California. And this was also a very astonishing accomplishment because others had attempted this same grueling flight, and 3 people actually died attempting this flight. And then there was another flight she took solo from Mexico City to New York. And then she also competed in the 1935 Bendix Trophy long distance air race and finished 5th in the competition. And sadly, one of the competitors actually died during takeoff due to a fire, but she continued to defy the odds. And although some faced a downturn, Earhart continued to outshine. And George Palmer Putnam, the publisher who had helped launch her public career, persistently pursued a relationship with her during their friendship. And after years of courtship, Amelia finally agreed to marry him. And she kept her last name, Earhart, and made it very clear that she did not intend to embrace the traditional expectations many women faced in marriage. And instead, she really viewed their relationship more as a partnership between equals, an unconventional stance for the era. And although during this time, the greatest challenge of her life was still waiting for her. So soon, Earhart would set out on the most ambitious flight ever attempted, a journey to circle the globe. And it would become one of history's greatest mysteries. This wouldn't be just another record-breaking flight. Unlike previous circumnavigations, she planned to follow a route closer to the equator, stretching nearly 29,000 miles, and it would be the longest aerial journey ever attempted around the globe, forcing both pilot and aircraft to endure some of the most unforgiving conditions on Earth. But before any of that could happen, she needed an airplane capable of surviving the impossible. So Purdue University believed in her vision and established the Amelia Earhart Fund for Aeronautical Research, providing $50,000, which today would be over $1 million, to make this expedition a reality. And with that support, Lockheed Aircraft Company built a brand new Lockheed Electra 10E specifically for the mission. This wasn't an ordinary airplane. Engineers transformed it into a long range flying machine by installing additional fuel tanks and making extensive modifications throughout the aircraft. And she affectionately called it her flying laboratory, seeing it not only as transportation, but also as a testing ground for the future of aviation. Now she needed the right crew, and her first choice for navigator was a man by the name of Harry Manning, a highly respected sailor, experienced pilot, and skilled radio operator. And the original plan seemed pretty simple at first. She would fly, and Manning would navigate. But during several practice flights across the United States, small concerns began to emerge. And on one flight, Manning made a navigational calculation that briefly placed the aircraft in the completely wrong state. This mistake wasn't catastrophic by any means. It fell within acceptable limits for the error, but it was enough to make Amelia's husband and manager, George Palmer Putnam, pretty uneasy to say the least, and they wanted absolute confidence before attempting the most ambitious flight in aviation history. Additionally, navigation tests followed, including a challenging nighttime flight. Once again, Manning performed reasonably well under difficult conditions, but Putnam and technical advisor Paul Mance remained unconvinced. The journey Amelia was planning would leave almost no room for error. A different navigator was needed. That search led them to one of the finest navigators in the world, Fred Noonan. Noonan wasn't simply experienced, he was legendary within aviation circles, a licensed sea captain, an expert in celestial navigation, and if anyone could guide her across the vast Pacific, it would be Fred Noonan. The original plan called for both navigators to participate, with Fred Noonan handling the most difficult stretch across the Pacific before Manning would rejoin Amelia later in the journey. Everything appeared to be falling into place, and then she would end the journey alone. For a moment, everything seemed to be unfolding exactly as planned. The aircraft was ready, the route was set, the dream that had pushed Amelia Earhart farther than any woman before her was within reach. Then, without warning, everything changed. On March 17, 1937, she and her crew departed on the first attempt to circle the globe. The opening leg carried them from Oakland, California, towards Honolulu, Hawaii. But even before reaching Hawaii, the Lockheed Electra experienced mechanical issues, with its propellers forcing the crew to stop at Pearl Harbor for repairs. After several days, the aircraft was declared ready. So the engines roared, the crew lined up on the runway at Luke Field, and this time they would finally begin the historic journey. But only seconds into takeoff, something went terribly wrong. The aircraft suddenly swerved out of control, its landing gear collapsed beneath it, and both propellers slammed into the ground as the Electra skidded violently across the runway before grinding to a stop on its belly. The dream of flying around the world had come crashing down before it had truly even begun. To this day, investigators have never reached complete agreement on what caused the accident. Some witnesses believed a tire had burst, and Amelia herself suspected the right landing gear had just simply failed. Others argued pilot error played a role, but whatever the cause, one fact was undeniable: the aircraft had been badly, badly damaged, and the world flight was over, at least for now. The battered Electra was shipped back to Lockheed's factory in California, where engineers worked tirelessly to rebuild it. Many people would have accepted the crash as a sign to just walk away, but Amelia Earhart wasn't one of them. As repairs continued, she and George Putnam secured additional funding and quietly began planning another attempt. This time, they made an important change. So instead of flying west across the Pacific first, they would instead begin in Miami and travel eastward around the globe, taking advantage of more favorable seasonal weather and wind patterns. To reduce weight, non essential equipment was completely removed from the airplane. There would be little room for anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. And by this point, Harry Manning had left the expedition, leaving Amelia and Fred Noonan as the final crew. On June 1st, 1937, the world watched as a daring journey began. From the bustling skies above Miami, a small aircraft lifted into the unknown, carrying with it the hopes, dreams, and determination of those who believed the impossible could be achieved. Over the next several weeks, they crossed South America, Africa, the Indian subcontinent, and Southeast Asia, pushing across vast oceans and unfamiliar lands. One successful landing after another seemed to prove that perhaps destiny was finally on their side. By June 29th, the pair arrived in La New Guinea. Nearly 22,000 miles were already behind them. Only one major obstacle remained, which was the Pacific Ocean. The next leg would carry them from La to one of the smallest and most isolated destinations on Earth, Howland Island. A tiny strip of coral, barely 6,500 feet long, raising only above 10 feet above the ocean. And finding it would be like locating a single grain of sand in an endless sea. Still, she and Fred believed they were ready. On the morning of July 2nd, 1937, their heavily loaded Electra lifted off from Lye, carrying roughly 1,100 gallons of fuel, and the flight was expected to last around 20 hours. Waiting for them at Howland Island was the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca, positioned there specifically to help guide them home. Its crew stood ready to communicate by radio and transmit navigational signals and even produce a towering column of black smoke that could be seen from miles and miles away. Every possible aid had been prepared, yet one by one each of these lifelines would fail. As the Electra pressed eastward, thick cloud cover forced Amelia to descend from 10,000 feet to around 7,000 feet. Despite the weather, radio messages reached Itasca loud and clear. The problem wasn't Amelia talking, the problem was hearing the answers. The crew aboard the Itasca could hear her voice loud and clear, but she could barely hear theirs. As the hours passed and tension intensified, as you can only imagine, at one point she reported being within roughly only 200 miles of the island and asked the ship to use its radio direction finder to guide her in, to help them locate her. And she began whistling continuously into the microphone, creating a steady signal the operators hoped they could track. Then another setback emerged. The Itasca's radio direction finding equipment couldn't properly tune to Amelia's transmission frequency. The operators listened helplessly as her voice came through very clearly, but without any reliable way to calculate her position. They didn't know exactly what to do. Minutes later, another message arrived, and she now believed they were just only about 100 miles away, the closest they had been yet. Time was running out, fuel was disappearing, and the island should have been visible. As the morning hours slipped away, a growing sense of uncertainty surrounded the Electra. By approximately 7:30 a.m., radio transmission suggested the aircraft had only about 30 minutes of fuel remaining. Every passing moment brought them closer and closer to the edge. She radioed once more, explaining that she believed they were very close, but one terrifying truth remained. She still could not find either the ship or Howland Island. Miles above the endless Pacific Ocean, the world famous pilot who had conquered the skies was now searching for a destination she could not find, with time rapidly running out. Desperate to establish a bearing, she asked the crew aboard the Itasca to transmit voice signals she could follow. The Coast Guard responded with the strongest signal they could possibly produce. From their perspective, she had to be somewhere very close. Close enough to hear them, close enough to reach safety, but despite receiving the transmissions, Amelia couldn't determine which direction that they were coming from. Somewhere over thousands of miles of open ocean, the world's most famous aviator was searching for an island she couldn't see, listening for a signal she couldn't follow, and unknowingly flying towards one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. For decades, investigators, historians, and aviation experts have searched for answers to one of history's greatest mysteries, and after conducting its official investigation, the U.S. government reached a sobering conclusion. Amelia Earhart's aircraft most likely exhausted its fuel supply before plunging into the vast Pacific Ocean, taking both Earhart and Fred Noonan with it. But yet the story didn't end there. In the 1970s, retired U.S. Navy Captain Lawrence Safford revisited the case with fresh eyes. He meticulously analyzed thousands of pages of radio transmissions and flight records, piecing together the final hours of the doomed journey. His conclusion was blunt. The flight had been plagued by inadequate planning and critical mistakes that left little room for error. That assessment has been echoed by many others over the years. Retired Rear Admiral Richard R. Black, who oversaw operations at the Howland Island airstrip and listened from the radio room aboard the Coast Guard cutter Itasca during Earhart's final approach, believed the Lockheed Electra disappeared into the ocean not far from Howland Island on the morning of July 2nd, 1937. Earhart's stepson, George Palmer Putnam Jr., also accepted the heartbreaking possibility that the aircraft simply ran out of fuel before reaching its destination. Several respected researchers shared that view. Biographer Susan Butler has suggested the Electra now lies hidden nearly 5 kilometers beneath the Pacific, forever out of reach on the dark ocean floor. Aviation curator Tom D. Crouch has even compared the aircraft's historical significance to that of the Titanic, describing it as another remarkable relic resting in the depths waiting for answers that may never come. Yet, even within this widely accepted theory, questions remain. If those theories are correct, Earhart's final flight wasn't brought down by a single catastrophic event, but by a chain of small decisions, mounting challenges, and unforgiving circumstances that ultimately sealed the fate of one of aviation's greatest pioneers. Until now. After nearly 9 decades of dead ends, competing theories, and relentless investigation, a discovery deep beneath the Pacific has reignited one of history's greatest mysteries. What researchers uncovered wasn't just another clue, it was something that could reshape everything we thought we knew about Earhart's final flight. The revelation is both heartbreaking and astonishing, painting a far more human story than the legends, conspiracies, and the rumors that have surrounded her disappearance for generations. In early 2024, an expedition connected to renowned deep sea explorer Dr. Robert Ballard, the oceanographer celebrated for locating the wreck of the Titanic, focused its search near Nicaragua Island, a remote coral atoll long believed by many researchers to hold the key to her disappearance. Resting roughly 2,000 feet below the surface against the edge of a steep underwater slope, investigators reported locating what appeared to be the mangled remains of a Lockheed Electra 10E. The sonar image slowly emerged from the darkness, revealing a shape that seemed frozen in time. Despite decades beneath the ocean, the aircraft's battered framework was still unmistakable, scarred by a violent impact but refusing to surrender its identity. Then came the moment that sent chills through everyone watching. Faintly etched across the twisted metal, almost erased by the sea itself, were the weathered characters NR16020, the same registration number of Amelia's plane. It was barely visible, but impossible to ignore. After all those years, the ocean appeared to be whispering the name of the missing aircraft back to the world. The mystery took another chilling turn when the forensic analysis revealed something no one expected. Instead of plunging straight into the open ocean, evidence suggests the Electra first slammed into the coral reef surrounding the remote atoll, and in that single revelation, decades of assumptions began to unravel. It appears Earhart and Fred Noonan may have survived the initial impact, escaping the crippled aircraft before it finally was claimed by the sea. If that is true, their greatest battle had only just begun. Stranded on an island with no way to call for help, they would have endlessly watched the horizon day after day, hoping to spot a passing ship that would never come. Every sunrise brought another chance for rescue. Every sunset made that hope a little bit harder. And as fresh water disappeared and food became scarce, survival slowly turned into a desperate fight against exhaustion, dehydration, and time itself. Investigators now believe the pair managed to salvage whatever they could from the wreck before rising tides swallowed it beneath the waves. That theory has taken on a new weight with the rediscovery of clues found on Nukamaro decades ago, including a weathered metal canteen and human skeletal remains that had puzzled researchers for years. When compared with the newly identified crash location, those forgotten pieces suddenly fit together like parts of a puzzle that had been scattered for generations. Now, scientists are taking another look at the evidence using modern forensic DNA analysis. While the investigation is still ongoing, early findings have sparked renewed excitement. with some researchers believing that the remains could finally belong to Amelia. If confirmed, it would mark the end of one of history's greatest aviation mysteries and reveal that her final chapter was far more heartbreaking than anyone had ever imagined. If the evidence ultimately proves conclusive, it could bring the world closer than ever before to solving a mystery that has endured for almost a century. So now the question remains, what really happened to Amelia Earhart? Did her plane vanish forever beneath the vast, unforgiving ocean, becoming one of history's greatest mysteries? Or is it possible that she and her navigator survived somewhere beyond the horizon, waiting to be found? After all these years, her disappearance remains a haunting reminder that some stories are truly never finished. They simply wait for someone to uncover the truth. And the mystery of her final flight continues to haunt the world, a story that echoes through time.